Just to go back to the early days, though, you attended the Berklee School of Music in your younger days. How do you look back on that time now in terms of your development as a musician?
Oh, I think it was pretty critical to the direction that I ended up going in, although it may not be obvious, since in that era they were not addressing singer-songwriting and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it was strictly a jazz school. Since then, of course, they branched out into all kinds of other aspects of music and the music business. But at that time, it was a little place with 300 students all wanting to play and or write jazz. I was studying composition, and I went there with the expectation that I would learn to compose music for jazz ensembles of various sizes, from large and small, and that kind of partly happened, but it over the couple of years or a year and a half that I was there, I discovered that there was that direction wasn't really where I needed to be going. When I dropped out of Berklee, I wasn't really sure where I was supposed to go, except that it would be guitar oriented, but I hadn't yet really got seriously into songwriting, but I just knew it would have to do with the guitar. And pretty soon after that, after I dropped out, I joined a band in Ottawa where I grew up, and that band was into doing original material, and I ended up writing for them, and then for subsequent bands I was in. This is all now the second half of the 60s.
There is an Australian connection to your early band days. You were once in a band called the Flying Circus, who changed their name to avoid confusion with Australia's Flying Circus, who were relocating to Canada around that time. Tell us about your Flying Circus and the type of band that was.
Well, it was a band that couldn't make up its mind whether it was going to sound like the band or be psychedelic. I was more interested in sort of going in a Frank Zappa direction, and the keyboard player was a big Garth Hudson fan, so he wanted to do music like that, and the drummer was into kind of Detroit R&B, and the bass player, I don't know what he was into, but we somehow amalgamated into a sound that worked more or less. I mean, I don't think any of the bands I was in that period were actually very good, but that band especially was doing sort of interesting stuff. It was an interesting mix of things. It just never really got very much beyond the rehearsal stage. We had a few gigs, but and they were actually interesting gigs, but we only had a few in the year or so that we were going.
Were you?
And as happens, things fell apart.
Were you already harbouring ambitions of one day pursuing a solo career back in those days?
I hadn't thought about it one way or the other. I was doing solo things along the way. I had developed some finger picking skills with acoustic guitar, and so at the same time as I was in these bands, and sometimes in connection with other members of those bands, I would do kind of folky stuff, show up at open mic sessions, and have the occasional gig as a solo performer, but I hadn't really dug seriously into where I should be going. I was just kind of letting it flow and seeing where it went. And but by the end of the decade, after that band that we just talked about at the Flying Circus, it had to change its name to All of Us, which was kind of precious. But there you go. It's called OLIVUS, right? Well, we thought it was terribly clever. But that band broke up, and I decided I'd had enough of bands, and I felt like there'd be an audience for the songs that I was writing if I performed them solo and in an acoustic format, and it turned out to be the case. It took a little while for it to grow to an appreciable size, but it did.
When your solo career began, it was around the time of that singer-songwriter movement of the early 70s, and I guess many conveniently just slotted you and labelled you in with that. Were you comfortable with that at the time?
Yeah, I mean, as much as I'm comfortable with being slotted as anything, that was it was an appropriate slot and also appropriately vague, because as a singer-songwriter, you could be, you could be James Taylor, you could be Joni Mitchell, you could be any number of protest singers who will hopefully remain nameless, and just it was a kind of catch-all for people that were writing their own songs, but performing them mostly acoustically, and that was okay. I'd far rather be thought of that way than at the time than as folk singer, which I always kind of had to argue against. It was like folk singer Bruce Cockburn, and I won a Juno Award, the Canadian version of the Grammys, for being top folk singer of the year. I mean, that just sounded so ridiculous, like top folk singer. What is that? And I felt, I've changed my mind on this somewhat, or at least I've stopped caring about it. But but back then I was quite particular about these kinds of details, and I thought, a folk singer is someone who sings music that's identifiable with a particular tradition.
Yeah.
Whether it's bluegrass or old-timey music or English ballads or Thai fiddle music or whatever it might be. That's folk music, and I didn't feel like I was connected to any particular tradition. I was drawing from all of them that I could reach, but to me there was a difference there, and to call somebody like me a folk singer was sort of dishonoring the people who were upholding those traditions. And so I didn't like the idea, but at the same time, I mean, you can only argue so much about stuff like that before you just drive people crazy and waste your breath.
Now, an important figure in your career and someone you've had a long association with, as have many Canadian musicians, is Bernie Finkelstein, who still works with you today. Have you ever pondered what direction your career may have travelled without Bernie?
It's hard to imagine that it would have gone anywhere, actually. I mean, something would have happened, but Bernie and I connected up in really at the end of 1969. He was planning on starting a record label, and he didn't have anybody signed up yet. Our mutual friend Gene Martinek, who was a guitar player from another band that I knew, wanted to be a record producer, and I wanted to make an album that didn't involve very much production, as I didn't want, at the time it was kind of fashionable for the singer-songwriter folks to show up with banks of strings with them and making heavily produced kind of albums. I didn't want to do that. I wanted an album that sounded like the people that influenced me in that direction, like the old blues guys like Mississippi John Hurt, whose albums just featured him singing and playing guitar. And to me, that's what I wanted my album to be like. So it worked out great because Bernie saw a chance to make a cheap album. And Gene got to produce an album, even though he probably would have liked to have done more with it. And I got to make my album. And that was the beginning of my relationship with Bernie. And it soon became apparent once the album was out that I was going to need a manager, because there were offers for shows coming in and people were contacting him because he was the only publicly visible contact point. And so he ended up becoming my manager, and he still is. All this time later.
Now, you mentioned Gene Martinek, who produced your albums for probably about the first decade or so of your career, but you changed producers, and I guess it almost coincided with the time that your songwriting began to take a more political direction. Was there a direct connection there between your switching producers and the change of the type of song you were writing?
Well, I think change was in the air. I also got divorced right around then. So there were a lot of changes taking place, and it was really the breakup of my home, in a sense, that precipitated the politics. I mean, I wasn't. It's a slightly indirect connection, but what I found was I had been, quite. I consider myself a Christian at that time for most of the 70s, and then and we had made a promise before God we were going to be married and stay married until we died, and all of a sudden here is the marriage breaking up, and God was letting it happen, and I'm going, well, what is this, And then at the same time I kind of realized, well, there's a big learning curve here, because I've had pretty much been a loner, except for my wife, and we were very close, but I didn't have a lot of social friends. And it occurred to me somewhere in all of that if the idea was that I'm supposed to love my neighbor, I should actually know who my neighbor is, and therefore to kind of get to know people. And so Kitty and I split up. I moved to Toronto from the rural place we had close to Ottawa, and I kind of embraced the Toronto community. And after a while, it embraced me too. At first, all these kind of like new wavy punk kids were looking at the guy with a tweed jacket, going, "What are you?" But after a while, they decided I was okay. Maybe it's because I bought a motorcycle jacket, but anyway, it all kind of went together. And at the same time as all those changes were taking place, it just seemed like maybe it's because I was listening to more pop music and especially reggae and punk and stuff like that than I had been. It just felt like I needed somebody that had a fresh approach to work with in the studio. So there were a couple of false starts, and I brought Gene back in a couple of albums later because I felt like I needed him back, but eventually it fell to mostly Jonathan Goldsmith and at first Jonathan and Terry Crawford when it was the co-workers, and that kind of carried me through the rest of the 80s, and then in the 90s I did an album with T-Bone Burnett, or two albums with him actually, and then Colin Linden has produced all the albums since then. Is that right? Except for one that Jonathan Goldsmith came back and did, because he's a very gifted string writer, and I wanted strings on this album. There's a kind of, it took a few decades, but I eventually caught up with the singer-songwriter movement.
So overall, is there generally a uniform quality that you look for in a producer to make them the type of guy you want to work with?
Well, they have to be compatible and kind of understand my vision of what we're going to do, but and also bring their own thing to it in some way that I can relate to. But more than anything, what I can't bring to it is the studio chops. I just don't know enough about the technology, about how to mic things, about how to just make things go in the studio. So even though I've been in the studio quite a lot over all these years, that's never been a body of information that I've absorbed much of. So I need somebody to handle that end of things, and the right producer will also have a vision, of where to take the ideas that I present them with, and who to. It's always done in consultation with me. I've never worked with a producer who just dictated how things were going to be. But a producer like T-Bone Burnett, for instance, has a vast network of musicians that he can call on for any purpose, So that was something, aside from his really good ears and his studio chops, he brought this access to this pool of great roots musicians, and so that's the kind of stuff that you end up working together on on the way into the studio, and then of course once everybody's in the studio, it's just a matter of playing music, getting it right.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit about your songwriting. Have you been conscious over the years of not letting the politically themed songs dominate your work? Do you still look for a nice balance between those songs and the non-political and more personal songs?
Well, yeah. The short answer is yes, I do look for that balance. In fact, though, the long answer is they're all personal. I don't. There are occasions where I've written a song, kind of in the abstract, kind of from an idea that I absorbed. If a Tree Falls, which got a fair amount of attention in Australia, is one of those songs where I was driving in my car, and one of the college radio stations in Toronto had a documentary on the destruction of the rainforest in Borneo, and I'm listening to this, and it was a very detailed and intense kind of radio show, and I'd never been in a tropical rainforest, but I'd been in the temperate rainforest on the west coast of Canada, so I kind of had a sense of what it felt like to be in one, and I was absorbing the imagery from what these people were talking about, and it just precipitated the writing of the song. So then I just thought of the line, the cliche from Philosophy 101, if a tree falls in the forest. So it just seemed to fit. But that's an exception to arrive at a song that way. Usually I have to get an emotional response to something. Well, I guess I had it with that too, but it more often requires something, some kind of more direct experience. So the political stuff that people most noticed came initially from travels in Central America and other parts of the so-called third world, and you travel in those places, and I wasn't being a tourist. I was there with various charitable agencies, or in some cases just because I knew somebody who invited me to go down and hang out, and so I could kind of have a sense of what was going on in the places in question. And I got to meet a lot of people in places like Nicaragua or Honduras, and eventually much further afield. And those encounters led to songs. So it's really, it wasn't so much that I had a political axe to grind. It was that I was meeting these people who were in one way or another victimized by the global economic system, and it seemed necessary to say something about that in the songs. But they're really, I mean, I suppose whether you judge them this way or not depends on your point of view. I don't like to think of them as polemics. I mean, to me, those songs are songs just as much from the heart as a love song or a song about God.
Did the radio recognition and commercial recognition of songs like When a Tree Falls, and of course If I Had a Rocket Launcher, did they surprise you at the time?
Yes, it sure did, especially Rocket Launcher. I mean, I thought Bernie had said, "Oh yeah, this is going to be the single of this album," and at that time people talked that way. They don't anymore, but back then there were singles, and I went, "Are you out of your mind? No radio station on earth is going to play that song." And it turned out I was wrong. And, it got a lot of play in various places, not enough to kind of make it into a worldwide hit or anything, but it got a lot of attention, and it kind of put me on people's radar in the U.S. in particular, in a way that nothing I'd done before that had, even though Wondering Where the Lions Are, which is a few years earlier, got more radio play by quite a bit. There was nothing. It was kind of a one-off, and after that, people weren't paying attention. But when the Ceiling Fire album came out with If I Had a Rocket Launcher and the other Central American stuff in particular on it, it was right at the time when people were kind of waking up to the fact that Ronald Reagan's assertion that there was no such thing as a war in Central America was a lie. And my album happened to come out right then, and people were going, "Oh wow, this is here's a guy that's addressing these questions we have," and that if you were a dissenter in the States, there was sort of no public forum for expressing that dissent. There were kind of underground magazines and stuff, but in Maine, there was no way for people to know that their feelings were not just their own. So we'd go play a show. People liked what they were hearing on the radio, and they'd come out to the shows, and they'd look around. There'd be 1,000 people all looking around the room, going, "Geez, I'm not alone." Mm-hmm. And it was very interesting for me. I'd never imagined anything like that happening, but it was so dramatic. You could see it from the stage and see people, kind of tuning in, and then realizing that there's a whole room full of people that felt just like they did about things. And and I'm sure my experience like that wasn't the only one. I think there were other artists addressing that stuff too, and in different ways, and they must have had a similar experience. But it was really kind of an eye opener for me to see that aspect of how music could affect people.
So, can songwriting be a therapeutic experience for you?
For me, yeah. I think it's the only therapeutic experience for me. So if I didn't have some outlet for that creative impulse, well, I guess I would have a different one if it weren't songwriting. But that's the most fun I have in life is chasing down an idea for a song. It's really, I mean, waiting for the idea to come is extremely frustrating. Like, it's just, it's just like waiting. Come on, I want to write something, and then an idea comes, and if I'm in a situation where I can actually focus on that idea and follow it through, then I feel like a bloodhound on a hunt. So it's a good feeling.
Your songs have been well covered by other artists over the years. So many have taken them on. Do you have any personal favourites? And have any of the arrangements that others have done of your songs changed the way that you look at the song yourself? And do you see it in a whole new light at times?
Yes and no. Yeah, hearing how somebody else approaches the song is usually disconcerting. And I mean, it's not always bad. Sometimes it is. Sometimes I think, oh, geez, I wish they hadn't done that. As an initial reaction, sometimes I amend that later when I hear it a few more times, and I kind of get what they were trying to do. But other times they'll bring something to it, and one of the most interesting covers that I've had, I mean, is somebody that is probably not at all familiar in Australia, but a Canadian jazz guitarist and composer named Michael Occhipinti made an album of my songs, it's a jazz album, and he completely deconstructed the song, but it's beautiful, and you can hear the originals in there somewhere. But I mean, even something like "Wondering Where the Lions Are," he just did a really imaginative take on these simple songs, and it while still respecting the bits and pieces that he was using, and that was an unusual thing. I mean, other people have recorded the songs and done very respectful versions of them that struck pretty close to the way I do them, which I can't fault them for that. It's very nice that they do that. But then every now and then somebody will come along with something interesting. Jerry Garcia did a cover of a song called "Waiting for a Miracle," and the music is great, but he got a lot of the words wrong, like really a lot. So that the song actually makes no sense whatever when you hear him sing it. But I was really bothered by that when I first heard it, and then I listened to the rest of the album, and he did exactly the same thing with Bob Dylan and every other, and all the other songs that I was familiar with that he was doing were treated the same way. So there was no disrespect there. It's kind of just his way of kind of making up the blank spots in the lyrics that he doesn't know quite right or didn't. Of course, past tense now, but and I met him at one point, and the first thing he said was, "Oh man, beautiful song. I hope I didn't mess the lyrics up too much." So, but he did it with his band. It wasn't the Grateful Dead. It was the Jerry Garcia band that did it, and they did a beautiful version of it musically. So, Now,
of course, people primarily think of you as a singer-songwriter, which I think at times it's a shame that maybe you're a little bit overlooked for your musicianship and your guitar playing. Have you ever pondered an instrumental album, a fully instrumental album?
Yeah, we've done one actually. There's an album called Speechless that came out a few years ago that's just instrumental, and I'm contemplating doing another one. I mean, right now we have a new album that's going to come out in September. That we've just finished. That's songs. It has one instrumental piece on it, but Bernie and I have talked about doing kind of Speechless 2, because a lot of people really like that album. I think the people who like what I do appreciate being given a rest from the barrage of lyrics from time to time, and you know, if they've come to a few shows, and you know, they're aware of the kind of stuff I do with the guitar. So I think that album has been pretty popular with the fans. But so I think it would be fun to do a second one, but I don't know. Right now, I'm still thinking mostly about the brand new one.
You released your memoir not too long ago. How did you find that experience, sitting down and writing a story?
Oh man, it was hard work.
Yeah.
That book took 3 years to write, and then maybe another year before that where I just dithered, not quite sure how to start. And during that period, I didn't write any songs. All of the creative energy went into the book. It came out okay. I'm very happy with the way it came out, but it was a labor for sure. I also, my daughter, who's now 5, was born about exactly the time I got deep into writing the book. So there was a lot of lack of sleep for those immediate the first 3 years. But the book came out. Came out okay. I got about 100 pages in, and I got bogged down, and I enlisted the aid of a journalist friend of mine named Greg King, who helped me with organizing primarily. Well, he helped a lot. He wrote as if he were me, and then I would take it, and therefore he provided a kind of structure to the book, which was really messing me up. The absence of a structure, or the failure on my part to figure out one. And so he got that going, and then I would take, you know, his kind of bare bones chapter and rewrite it as in my own voice. And that's kind of how we finished the book. And I think it benefited greatly. It's a lot more political in content than I would have made it. The publisher is a company called HarperCollins. They approached me to write what they called a spiritual memoir. And I said, well, what's a spiritual memoir? And they had no answer for that. They sort of said, well, we don't know, but we figure you'll come up with it. And so my orientation in starting into the book was that. But when I got Greg involved, he doesn't really see the world in those terms so much, and he's an old, like one of the original Earth Firsters, and kind of very, very committed to environmental issues and social justice, and he went to town on it. You know, being a journalist too, he had the resources and the know-how to kind of research things. So we ended up. There's part of the book talks about a trip that I took to Chile in 1983 during the Pinochet dictatorship. And Greg came up with so much stuff on Chile. We could have written a whole book just on that, on you know, how the revolution came about, how they ended up with an elected Marxist government that was overthrown by the U.S. and in the name of, you know, business, etc. Familiar story, but you know, he had done so much research that I had to be quite merciless, cutting things out. But I think we got the gist. You know, we got the necessary information in there. But it was a lot of fun to kind of read through. Wow, there's all this information that I didn't possess at the time that I went there, and it put things in quite a different. Well, I was going to say quite a different light. It really wasn't that different. It just added a lot of detail, a lot of richness to what I did know. Some of which we managed to keep in. So was it hard to get back into songwriter mode once the book was finished? You know, I wondered if I was ever going to write a song again after all that time.
Really?
And I, I thought maybe I'm supposed to be a prose writer now, or maybe, because I didn't have any ideas at first. But then they started coming, and I ended up with an album's worth of songs. So it felt strange at first, and then after I had 2 or 3 songs, it started feeling like it always used to feel.
Now, you're based in San Francisco these days. What prompted your move there, and how are you in San Francisco getting along?
Well, I moved to San Francisco because my wife got a job here, and we got together 12, maybe 13 years ago, and at that point, soon after we got together, she'd been living in San Francisco, went east and went to law school, became a lawyer, and then got a job back out in San Francisco again. So I had been commuting from my house in Canada back and forth to New York, and then she would do the same if she had a weekend free, and so on. So, but once she was coming out here, the commute got too long to sustain. I did it a few times, but it was fun. But you can't just keep driving 2,500 miles just to see your gal. so I moved too. Then we got married and we have a kid, and that's the story.
I know.
And it's sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
that's right.
The city. It's a beautiful city, San Francisco. It's not the San Francisco that we learned about in the from the Beat generation through the hippie movement and so on. It's not that San Francisco. There's vestiges of it still here, but only vestiges. It's tech city now, and kind of stupidly expensive, but it is a beautiful place, and there's a lot of good people here. So it's doing. I think it's doing me right.
Yeah. I know here in Australia over the years there's a complex that exists amongst many artists and musicians that they haven't really made it until they've made it in America. They seek that American approval. Considering Canada is right next door, does that exist over there as well?
Less than it used to. When I was starting out, it was entirely the rule. I mean, it wasn't just a kind of covert feeling that people had. It was like, if you didn't succeed, and if you didn't leave Canada, go to the States, or maybe to a lesser extent Britain, and get a step of approval there, don't bother coming back. Nobody wanted to know about you at all. There were one or two exceptions. Gordon Lightfoot was pretty standout exception to that.
Yeah.
But I remember having a big argument on the street one day in Ottawa. I can't remember with whom a guy, but I don't remember if I knew him. We got talking about Joni Mitchell, and he was insisting that she could not possibly be Canadian because she was good. Nobody good was Canadian. And I mean, that's how people thought. That changed in the early 70s, or it started to change, and it's been now. I mean, it sort of doesn't make any difference where you're from now because everything's global. And so, do people care that Bryan Adams and Alanis Morissette and et cetera are Canadian? They don't really. I mean, Canadians care, but I don't think the rest of the world cares where they're from.
True.
And I think now. You still, I mean, I get referred to as a Canadian, of course, which I'm happy to be. It's true, and I feel like a Canadian, in spite of living where I'm living. But at the same time, Canada's only too happy to welcome Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and while he was alive, Leonard Cohen, kind of back into the fold without any question whatever, because and kind of owning them as Canadian artists, even though all of them spent almost all of their time out of Canada for decades. And I don't think that's really exactly wrong. I think that maybe some aspects of that get over, but I think where you come from affects what you do, and I don't think it's about patriotism particularly. It's the growing up in Australia is different from growing up in Canada, is different from growing up in the U.S. The emotional environment that you're surrounded by is different in each place. The things that are soft and the things that are hard in your upbringing are. Sometimes they're universal, but sometimes they're not. Some of that is conditioned by the place you're in too. So some I get asked now and then, well, what's different about Canadian music from American music? And I don't know how to define it, but it's not an accident that Canada produced Leonard Cohen and Joni Mitchell, and America produced Tom Waits and Lucinda Williams. All of whom are great songwriters, and all totally different from each other. And but there is no Canadian Tom Waits or Canadian Lucinda Williams. There are people who do something that's somewhat in terms of genre, but there's something about the way you identify with the place you're in that's distinct from country to country, I think.
So true. Now, before I let you go, there is a new album coming out later in the year. What can you tell us about it?
It's called Bone on Bone. It has, as I said, one instrumental piece. It's a solo guitar piece of that title. Actually, that's where the album title came from. And then and a bunch of songs. And the songs they range from kind of pretty spiritual oriented ones to there's to a song, for instance, called False River that talks about oil spills. More of a hypothetical one than the actual ones. Tries to paint a picture of that kind of scenario, and then and things with the sort of I don't know how to characterize it really. I suppose songs about being alive in era, what it feels like.
Are you critical of your own work once you've released an album? Do you find yourself going back over it and thinking of changes you wish you could have made?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even now, before it isn't even out yet, and I'm doing that. It's terrible. But you got to stop somewhere. I mean, it's the same with any creative endeavor. It's the same with the book. You can keep on working on it, but if somebody doesn't say, "Look, it has to stop. This is it."
Yeah.
You just go. You go out here and head where it shouldn't be, and end up going in circles.
So true. Hey, Bruce, thanks so much for your time. It's been an honour and a pleasure to catch up with you. I've been a big fan since I saw you on your first Australian trip way back in the early 80s, and we look forward to the new album with much anticipation.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate your interest, and I've enjoyed talking to you.
All the best. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Okay, you too. Bye.
Bye.